Hello. Today we are going to discuss fifth chapter of our book, Political Thought. In this chapter, we are going to look at to the political developments of the 15th century. When we look at the period starting with the 15th century, it is inevitable to notice that the societies and the various forms of the human relations were being transformed in dramatic ways. Obviously, most of the transformations that were being experienced at that time were source of inspirations for quite a number of philosophers. We call most of these philosophers as great figures of modern political philosophy. Among those figures, we can point out Bodin, Hobbes, Machiavelli, Locke, Hume, and many other philosophers as well. The fifth chapter of the book mainly deal with ideas of these philosophers. It starts with touching upon various developments leading to the political thoughts of what we call 15th century as the New Age. Then the chapter briefly explains one of the most influential philosophers of authority and power issues, namely Machiavelli. Following this, it gives a brief explanation on certain developments leading to the Protestant Reformation period. Afterwards, it allocates significant space to discuss on ideas of Bodin, Thomas More, and particularly his book called Utopia, Thomas Hobbes and David Hume, as well as John Locke and Spinoza. At the end of the 15th century, the consequences of various economic changes resulted in revolutionary transformations in the structure of the medieval organizations. In spite of the theories of the universal church and the universal empires, such as medieval organizations dependent on the idea that both economic and political organization in medieval society were completely local organizations. It is important to keep in mind that this was a period when communication opportunities were very limited. On the other hand, with the development of the communication possibilities, economic superiority started to change from determinate ways and monopolized markets to the directions of liberated markets. Regulating the standardization of goods and quality of it were expected to be conducted by governments at that time. All of the European kingdoms initiated such kinds of regulations. And in the 16th century, all kingdoms deliberately adopted the policy of running national sources, promoting trades both at home and abroad, and developing national powers. When we look at when we look at the Machiavelli's contribution to the political thought, we see first that Machiavelli's influential book called The Prince. The group that Machiavelli mainly addresses in his work, titled The Prince, is one of the is a person who seizes and maintains power through force. Machiavelli says very little in The Prince about for which reason or for which purpose princes wish to come to power. But the work is full of advices about the means that can be used in policy. According to Machiavelli, the main means of prince to seize the power is violence. A prince who wants to hold the power shouldn't have any other purpose or thought than war, according to Machiavelli. Machiavelli distinguishes between the violence that is applied rightly and cruelty that can be applied wrongly when a prince is coming to the power. However, this definition is not based entirely on a moral basis, and for Machiavelli, it's an appropriate behavior for a prince to resort to violence intensively with the purpose of securing himself against threats. Once a prince defeats his enemies, then he may leave aside ruling by means of violence. When we look at the New Age, we see certain developments, which one of which is the Protestant Reformation. The development of cities in the 16th century turned these places into centers where new relations, new classes, new demands, expectations, and political struggles were connected. Especially the bourgeois, using the bourgeois class, using the money from trade, made the cities the main places of the conflict between the social classes. On the other hand, the bourgeois class and the urban middle class were the main supporting forces behind the periods that we address as Renaissance and the Reformation periods. Those who politicized the Reformation movement on another level were peasants. Especially when the Renaissance was spreading to Europe, its content began to change. And increasing numbers of translations were made from Greek and Latin languages, and there was an increasing desire not only to read the ancient masterpieces, but also to challenge their findings. The best example of this situation could be given as the scientific developments of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. There are certain number of philosophers who are quite influential when we look at the New Age. Among those philosophers, we can count, first of all, Bodin and Thomas More. For Bodin, the sovereign power is a sign that distinguishes the state from all other groups. Bodin describes citizenship as being the subject of the sovereign power. According to Bodin, in addition to being a subject of a common sovereign, citizens may have countless other connections among one another. But what makes them citizen is their being subject. In relation to this, Bodin has defined sovereignty as the supreme form of power, which is not restricted by laws over citizens and subjects. Looking at Thomas More and his great masterpiece, which is called the Utopia, we see that it is mainly his great masterpiece, the Utopia, is mainly concerned with the happiness of people. According to More, happiness is not a singular thing, but happiness has a collective characteristic. The way to reach happiness in the society is through implementing the equality principle, according to More. Equality, in Moore's thought, cannot be ensured in a state where the property is monopolized and absolute. Thus, eliminating the ownership of property or holding property is the only way to distribute the wealth of the country equally and fairly. And this is the way to make people happy in his thought. Because of such thoughts, Thomas More is usually considered in today's literature as well as one of the very first utopic socialists. Um, when we look at other philosophers of the New Age, we also notice Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. For Hobbes, the state is not a biological entity, but it is a mechanical body. This emphasis on the mechanical body takes Hobbes' thought to a different level. First of all, it takes him to a position against the religious authority and the scholastic philosophy that feeds it. Second, Hobbes' mechanical metaphor removes the political arena from dominant religious notions about the divine right of the kings and of those who are blessed by God. Thus, politics becomes a human creation made for human purposes in Hobbes' thought. A third issue is that, based on Hobbes' point of view, the state is purified from its sensory properties. The state is treated separately as a simple mechanism to protect our homes and families. Therefore, it ceases to be a place related belonging and appropriation. Fourth issue in Hobbes' thought, different from the Machiavelli, Hobbes believed that the performing permanent acts with regard to political creation should be a job of great people. So a red-blooded prince is replaced with a bodiless system that can create stability without the help of the charismatic leader. On the other hand, Locke's discussions is based on a more of an ethical background of certain rights. For example, he treats the property as the natural right of human beings. Locke firstly stated that all the assets in the world were common properties at the beginning of humankind's life. Locke's basic determination related to property is that property is natural for all people. And in this way, what Locke considers in a narrow sense is labor that a person creates with his physical strength and skill. Locke has some limitation on acquiring property, and these can be pointed out as a sufficiency limitation, spoilage limitation, and the labor limitation. Of course, when we look at the development starting with the 15th century, intellectual developments in the period of New Age, we cannot ignore two important philosophers as David Hume and Spinoza. Looking at Hume's works, it is not surprising that he was one of the most influential figures of the entire history of the political thought. According to Hume, the main reason for the existence of the state is not to reach a just society that is defined in an abstract form, but to prevent injustices in the society so as to provide the continuity of social cooperations between the actors of society that could be peoples of different groups. According to Hume, injustice is mainly caused by the violations of property rights. And we will keep to discuss about Hume in detail in the 8th chapter of our book, Political Thought. On the other hand, Spinoza discussed most of the issues related to political thought in a more transcendental form than the philosophers lived in his era as well. The theoretical differentiations of democracy in Spinoza manifests itself in concepts related to social contract and reason. According to him, all civil societies can be regarded to have emerged as a result of a closely related open contract. This is because it's extremely rational for people to escape from the misery and insecurity of the natural state in which they are pursuing solely for their own desires and appetites. If we look at the chapter in overall, we see that the chapter mainly deals with the development in both social and intellectual life of Europe that has led to emergence of what we call today as the period of Enlightenment. As an influential source of inspiration for the Enlightenment period, this chapter mainly deals with certain philosophers' ideas like Bodin and sovereignty, Locke's on the property rights as the natural right, David Hume and the idea of justice as well as the state, Thomas Hobbes and his discussions of the formations of the state and administrative duties of the state, as well as Machiavelli and how power should be used by the ruler and the justifications of violations to hold the power in Machiavelli's thought. Also, this chapter also deals with the idea of democracy and the social contract, the early forms of the social contract in Spinoza's thoughts and discussions. Thank you to join me today.